Before we begin, I want to clarify what exactly this video is about. The word incel is commonly used these days as a slur that is essentially synonymous with misogynist, but that's not what I'm talking about here in this video. I'm talking about incels as in any involuntarily celibate man that participates in some way, shape, or form in online incel or black pill communities, or any involuntarily celibate man that self-identifies as an incel. So I'm actually not using the broadest definition of the term here because that would include literally any and all men that are involuntarily celibate. So I am specifically referring to incels that do self-identify as incels or black pillars. Okay, so with that disclaimer out of the way, let's talk about it. Misconceptions that people have about incels. Misconception number 1. Incels have right-wing political views. Incels are often associated with right-wing or conservative politics, but in truth, incels are an extremely diverse group consisting of men with a broad range of political beliefs. A 2025 study conducted by Swansea University and the University of Texas at Austin actually found that incels are more likely to have slightly left-leaning views. Now, the information presented in this study was collected in the form of self-reported survey responses, so the argument could be made that many of the respondents were somehow misrepresenting their own political views. And that is possible, but as someone that's actually spent a decent amount of time in these communities online, I can tell you with complete confidence that incels are an extremely diverse group in terms of political beliefs. There absolutely is a large contingent of incels that would consider themselves to be left-leaning or even progressive. And there are also a lot of incels with more right-wing views, including those with radical right-wing views. There are a lot of incels that actually hold the man with the little mustache in high regard. That is true. But that is certainly not a majority, and in fact, I think it's actually safe to say that a very large portion of incels are just relatively disengaged politically. So they don't really have strong political views any which way. I think the reason that incels are often slandered as right-wing by critics is really just because the word incel itself is more often used as a slur than it is used for its actual meaning. So people opposed to right-wing politics often curse those with right-wing viewpoints by calling them incels, which just muddies the waters. It really isn't fair to actually involuntarily celibate men, because, like I say, they definitely do not all hold right-wing views. And many of them are actually very far to the left side of the political spectrum. Misconception number 2. Most incels are straight white men. This misconception really could not be further from the truth. If you've ever browsed incel forums for even a minute, or if you have any familiarity at all with Black Pill YouTube, then it should be pretty obvious to you that incels are actually an extremely diverse group, ethnically speaking. And that goes for sexual orientation as well. I'm pretty sure the majority of incels are heterosexual, but there's definitely a sizable number of incels that identify as bisexual. And you don't have to just take my word for it. In that 2025 study that I mentioned earlier, it was found that 58% of incels were white and 42% were non-white. And unless I'm mistaken, they only surveyed people from the United States and the United Kingdom, which are 62% white and 83% white, respectively. So, if anything, white men are underrepresented in the incel community. I think this misconception probably exists for much the same reason that the misconception about incels' political views exist. Some of the most vocal critics of straight white men are so called progressives, and progressives also just so happen to be one of the groups most likely to use incel as a slur. So there's a lot of random straight white men getting slurred as incels for various reasons, and so this misconception has developed that incels must all be straight white men. And it's kind of a meme at this point, but I think there's probably some truth to the notion that a very vocal minority of people online are very quick to assume that anything they deem bad is the result of malicious straight white men. So that might have something to do with it. But yeah, incels truly are just a very diverse group in every sense of the word. Misconception number 3. Incels are misogynist. Incels hate women. This is a misconception, but there is a kernel of truth in there. I wouldn't be surprised if it is a slight majority of incels that truly do hate women, and a lot of incels, even if they don't just outright hate all women, a lot of them do hold at least some misogynistic views. So it's easy to see why this misconception exists, but I really don't think it's fair to paint such broad strokes over such a large and diverse group. For a lot of men that find themselves in the situation where they just are not able to find romantic success no matter what they do, there's really not a lot of options for them if they want to discuss their experiences openly. A lot of incels don't even have any real life friends to talk to, or even if they do, they often end up being met with denial or resistance or even gaslighting by whoever it is they've decided to open up to. Another option, of course, is to speak to a therapist, but for various reasons, that's probably not the best option for most. So these online incel communities, or black pill spaces, or whatever you want to call it, these are the most readily available option for those that share the common experience of being unable to attract women to have a place to talk about their experience. So you might wonder, how could someone that doesn't hate women bear to commiserate with and to participate in discussion with people that do hate women? Well, like I said, if you are an involuntarily celibate man and you have any desire whatsoever to talk about your experience, then incel communities are pretty much the only readily available option. And since there are a large number of non-misogynistic incels in these communities, there's enough non-misogynists there bearing the label of incel that it's actually just ridiculous to make the assumption that just because somebody identifies as an incel, that means that they hate women. Misconception number 4. Incels are violent. There have been several very high-profile cases where individual incels have committed extreme acts of violence. But in my experience in black pill spaces online, it's only a very small minority of incels that actually praise these acts. The majority of incels wholeheartedly denounce these violent acts. I understand why the misconception exists. The average person only even knows about the word incel because of these high-profile crimes, so of course most normal people will make that association. The mainstream media more or less acts as if incels are a terrorist organization, and that just is not true. If you pick any two random incels and put them in a room together, chances are they will probably disagree on just as many things as they agree on. It really is a very diverse group, and I can't stress that enough. But the idea that all incels are violent is a dangerous one because it puts innocent people at risk of reputational and physical harm. Seriously, the average incel is not any more or less violent than the average person in the general population. And search all you want, but you are never going to find any evidence to refute what I'm saying here. Misconception number 5. Incels are red-pilled. A lot of people seem to think that the incel ideology is synonymous with red pill ideology, and there might be some overlap, but it's really just a totally different thing. Generally speaking, red pill adherents believe that anyone can be successful as long as they do the right things and act the right way. Incels, on the other hand, are black pilled. They believe that self-improvement is an act of futility and all they can do is just accept their lot in life. So basically, incels tend to be nihilistic, while red pillers tend to believe strongly in the powers of self-improvement. There's even a sizable contingent amongst red pillars that believe that looks don't even matter for a man, or that unattractive looks is just something that can be overcome through other means, such as having dominant social skills. While incels, on the other hand, tend to believe that looks are the only thing that matters, or at least that looks are extremely important and that it's not something that can ever be fully overcome. But I do get why this misconception is so common. For someone that's chronically online, like myself, these things are pretty obvious, but the average person doesn't actually consume any so-called manosphere content. So from a distance, all this red pill, black pill, alpha, beta, whatever, all this stuff looks the same from a distance. But in reality, the black pill, which is the ideology that most incels identify with, and the red pill, they have very little in common. So, incels are not red pilled. That is just completely not true. Misconception number 6. Incels are basement dwelling losers. While it is true that a large number of incels do live the neat lifestyle, it's certainly not something that applies to all incels or even to the majority of incels. Believe it or not, most incels do work, and plenty of them actually work in high-paying or even prestigious fields. One thing about incels that you may or may not realize is that a larger than average proportion of incels are neuroatypical in some way, with many incels suffering from autism spectrum disorder. So that is something that contributes to the fact that a relatively large proportion of incels do struggle to find and maintain steady employment. So even in cases where individual incels are essentially living the neat lifestyle, it isn't always just due to laziness or a lack of ambition. Sometimes that's true, but not always. And regardless of that, like I said, the reality of the situation is that most incels do work, and a lot of them actually are very successful in their careers. So it's just not true that incels as a group lack ambition. Misconception number 7. Incels are mentally ill. I already touched on this a bit, but it is true that a relatively large proportion of incels are on the autism spectrum or they're neuroatypical in some other way. And I guess it's just a matter of semantics whether or not you consider someone with autism spectrum disorder to be mentally ill or not. But there seems to be a misconception that incels are all deeply mentally ill in a way that's more severe than that. I don't have any hard data on this, but I would be surprised if rates of psychotic disorders like schizophrenia or personality disorders like borderline personality disorder, bipolar, or narcissism, I would be surprised if any of those things were significantly more common amongst incels compared to the rest of the population. But even if incels are more likely to suffer from mental illness, which I don't think is true, but even if it is, it's certainly not most incels that are mentally ill. If you only take away one thing from this video, I hope it's this. The average incel really is not all that different from the average person that isn't an incel. The main difference between incels and quote unquote normies is that most incels are fairly unattractive and oftentimes they have had some sort of negative life experiences that have caused them to have severe social anxiety, or perhaps they're just socially isolated for other reasons, which makes it difficult for them to attract women. In a lot of cases, the only differentiating factor between an incel and a normie is that the incel has spent more time analyzing his life situation. So, just because somebody identifies as an incel, that doesn't mean that they're mentally ill. They might even be someone you have a lot in common with the only difference between you being that the incel has had worse luck in life. Misconception number 8. Incels are the ones to blame for their own celibacy. While I'm sure it's true in some cases that some individuals are only celibate because of their own bad decisions, that is not always the case. And for most incels, that's not the case. Now, for me personally, I actually think I could be considered to be at fault for my own celibacy because I have had closer opportunities than a lot of others, and every time it was pretty much my own fault that nothing happened. But there are a lot, and I do mean a lot, of involuntarily celibate men that truly do not deserve to be celibate. Obviously, I'm not saying that any woman owes her affection to any man, but it is true that a lot of incels are only in the position they're in because, well, frankly speaking, they are very unattractive. And in the modern society we're living in, where women have thousands upon thousands of options in their pocket, dating apps, well, it is very difficult to attract a woman if you are an unattractive man. I already know most average people, for some reason, are very resistant to this idea, but the truth is, some men really are just too ugly to attract any woman. Now, I'm sure if you showed a picture of an unattractive incel to literally all 4 billion women on this planet, you could probably find some women that would find him attractive, but no man actually has access to that many women, and frankly, it's not reasonable to expect a somewhat unattractive man to have to settle for a literally physically deformed, elderly homeless woman in order to have intimate relations. But in reality, that is oftentimes the only realistic option for an unattractive man. So even if a lot of incels might actually technically be able to find a mate if they settle for a woman that is objectively far beneath them in terms of looks and hygiene and intelligence and everything else, it's still not fair to say that it's their own fault they are celibate. Misconception number 9. Incels are not deserving of sympathy. This is really just a natural extension of the misconception that incels are to blame for their own celibacy, because if you think that it's someone's own fault for being in the situation that they're in, then it just goes to reason you're probably not going to be too sympathetic towards them. But I do want to mention this specifically because the amount of vitriol and disdain and ridicule that incels face is honestly, it's sickening. And it's not fair at all. As I've stated multiple times throughout this video, incels are not a monolithic group. Individual incels encompass a wide variety of beliefs, ethnicities, nationalities, income brackets, social classes, and any other identity factors you can think of. Incels are not a monolith. Yes, there are incels that subscribe to various forms of politically radical ideologies, and there are incels that hate women, and there are incels that glorify violence. But those are not the majority. Not by a long shot. Most incels are involuntarily celibate due to factors mostly outside their control. And believe it or not, there's a good chance, whoever you are, that you actually personally know at least one incel in your real life and you just don't realize it. These are real human beings that have real struggles, and it just so happens that the struggles they face don't really get much sympathy. They don't gain any social capital for their struggles like many other so-called underprivileged groups do, and in fact, they are more often than not ridiculed or even demonized for their struggles. So next time you think about using the word incel as an insult, or you start to laugh at the idea of a 30-something-year-old man still being a virgin, please think about everything I've said here in this video, because when you do those things and you make unfair assumptions about a large, diverse group of people, all you're really doing is you're contributing to a societal landscape that ultimately is not good for anybody. You're making the world a worse place to live in for all people. And honestly, you're being kinda gay. If you found anything in this video informative or maybe just entertaining in some way, then I really would appreciate it if you could subscribe or like the video. But either way, thank you for watching.